welcome to So Lounge. Today we are working with McCall's 8220, also labeled as R11039, and we are making a dolman shirt that is gathered and then buttons up the front. So if you've been wondering how to gather the front of your top and attach the facings, stay tuned because that's what we're working on today. So Lounge is the place to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got a question or a comment, leave it below. I'd love to hear back from you. So before we get started, we need to make sure that we have all of our facing pieces cut out. So there is a front left and a front right, and then we have the back neck facing. So you should have 2 of each of those, so a total of 6 pattern pieces. And I specifically marked the pieces that go on the front by putting the buttonhole markings on them. So I know that those are the ones that go to those specific pieces with the pattern matching that we did in a previous video. With the ones that are going to go on the inside of my garment, I have pinned the interfacing to them to keep them separate and be able to distinguish them because essentially they are all the exact same pattern pieces. Now, once you get your pieces all ready to go, we're going to take a look at the instructions. Let's go in for a closer look. We are starting here at step number 11, and this is the section that is going to be labeled band. Now earlier I called that a facing because to me it looks a lot like a facing. Facings look exactly like the band, but to avoid confusion, keep in mind that we are making the band. I may refer to it as a facing, but that's what I mean. So we are going to start with some stay stitching in step number 11. We are going to stitch between these 2 large circles that are at the very top of our gathers. We're going to stay stitch around that neckline and come back down. Next, we will move on to step number 12, where we're going to sew our band pieces together, and then we're going to press open those seams. And then last, we will move down to step number 13, where we actually assemble the band to the shirt. We're going to adjust those gathers, get those all lined up. We're going to put in a row of basting stitches to get it situated, and then we will go back and stitch with a permanent stitch line. We'll do a little bit of trimming and some pressing, and then that will be our video for today. We are starting with step number 11, which is stay stitching. If you haven't come across stay stitching in any of your other patterns, it is a way to keep a curve from stretching. So whenever you're going to put a collar or a neckband onto a neckline, you're usually going to do stay stitching to keep that from stretching out while you work on it. Now, stay stitching is just a regular stitch length. So I'm going to be sewing at 2.5 length, and that's what I usually sew the rest of my seams with. The only difference is that we're going to put it inside of that seam line. So we're going to sew it at 3/8 of an inch. That way it'll hold everything in place, but it's not going to get in the way of our seams once we go in and attach the facing to our shirt. It'll be out of the way, it'll be inside that seam, and that's where we want it to be. So make sure that your sewing machine is set to your usual stitch length, and that is just a straight stitch, it's nothing fancy. And then get out a measuring device, or maybe you've got the mark on your sewing machine, and we're gonna start stitching at 3/8 of an inch. Let's go in for a closer look. So I have my measuring gauge. We are going to be stitching at 3/8 of an inch. And from my needle, let me make sure I got that lined up right. Yes, it is gonna be the very first line that is just past my presser foot. So that's the one we're going to line up with. If you have a magnetic seam gauge and you want to use that, you can just slap that on there. That makes it a little bit easier to see. And we are going to be starting from the large dot, which you can see a little bit better from the inside. And we're going to be going around the entire neckline and back to the large dot on the other side. So to get started, just get everything lined up, and then we are just going to start stitching all the way around. And just make sure when you stay stitch at the shoulder seams here, we are going to want to keep those open so that when we attach the facing, there isn't going to be a lot of excessive bulk in there. We want everything to be nice and flat. See, we're coming around to it here. And let me just move my shirt. Smooth this all out. Keep everything as smooth as possible while you are sewing. And don't pull on this neckline as you're going around it. Just kind of gently let it feed through the machine. And we are just coming back. The yellow circle, it's yellow on this side, is right here. So that is where we're going to stop. Lift up our needle. You do not need to backstitch with stay stitching. It's going to be inside the seam, so it's not going to go anywhere. And that is what it is going to look like. Once you are done with the stay stitching, just put your shirt off to the side. We will be getting back to that in step number 13, but for now we are moving on to step number 12, and we need to pin our pieces of our front facing to the back so we can get everything all lined up and ready to put onto our shirt. So just match up those notches. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. Okay, no, I'm not. So you want to make sure that this little point that's kind of an angle, that's going to go against the center front. So you want to make sure that you're matching the notches correctly to the correct side of your neck piece so that both of these are pointing towards the inside. Here's the other one. I get these all lined up. And we're just going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch as usual. Once you get yours all pinned together, let's go in for a closer look. We are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch, so I need to move my seam gauge over to the 5/8 inch mark and get that all lined up. And then I'm going to line up my facing with that outside edge and lower my presser foot to kind of hold everything in place. I'm going to smooth out these edges over here so everything is nice and flat, and then I'm going to take out this pin. So I am going to backstitch just because I know I'm going to be handling these and I do not want them to come out. So just went forward a stitch, go back 2 stitches, and then go forward again. And I am just going along this edge, and then I'm going to backstitch and come off that edge on the front. And that is all there is to it. So this is what it looks like when you're done. Repeat on the other side. We are just quickly going to press open these seams so that they lie flat once we attach the facing to our garment. Now remember, we're just pressing, so all that involves is lifting and putting the iron down on our fabric. I have my iron set to the cotton linen setting, which is the fiber content for my fabric. Please set yours accordingly so that you do not have a problem or any kind of a melty mess because your fabric has nylon or polyester in it. I'm just going to press the other one real quick, and then we will head back to the sewing machine. I initially thought we could just pin the facing to our shirt at the sewing machine and then immediately start sewing. And then I remembered that we still had to do the gathering. Now, gathering is part of the instructions of step number 2. They want you to sew in all your basting and put those gathers in all at once. I decided to save it for this step of attaching the facing because that way we know we have the right amount of gathering in. If you did step number 2 and you gathered your fabric, you may be thinking, did I gather it enough? Did I gather it too little? How do I know? You'll know when you can attach the facing and everything all lines up so that gathered edge lines up with the facing, and then the notches on the facing match the notches on the front panel of our shirt. So by doing the gathering when we attach the facing, we only have to do it once, and then we can get it all done in that single step and know that we've gathered just the right amount to make everything match up. So we are at step number 13. Let's go in for a closer look. We are at step number 13, and it says pin band to top, shirt by top, right sides together, matching the notches, center backs, side seams, and circles, clipping the top where necessary, and then we're adjusting the gathers. We're going to baste it, then we're going to stitch it, then we're going to trim seam allowances, and we will head back to the ironing board and press those seam allowances towards the band. So when you look at this picture, it's showing us all the steps at the same time. And what you have to keep in mind is that this is the right side, and that's the facing after it's been sewn. So we are pinning it to create this seam here, which is the seam shown here. So once we adjust our gathers and match our notches, then we're going to baste and then stitch our permanent stitch line, but this is what it's going to look like once it's unfolded. So it's a little bit confusing in this picture because you're kind of at the very end, and then the seam allowance is going to go towards the band once we press, but that is what we're going to be doing. That'll be the end result of what it will look like once we have pinned and sewn everything together. I have my front panel here, and this is the left front panel. We are going to be attaching this so that the right sides are together. Now, when you look at these, you may be thinking, that doesn't look like that's going to match up. But it has to, because we've got a notch here that matches up, and then we have our shoulder seam that matches up here, and then we have our neck notches that all match up here, which I have already pinned into place so that nothing moves around while I'm showing you how to do this. So the trick is that we need to gather this, and we need to gather it between the two markings, and then we need to match up our facing so that the gathers, the two dots, match up to the top, and the gathers are between here. So that's how we know how much we need to gather this edge. It needs to fit between these two dots once we get this all lined up. So you can see that the notch is here, and our two dots are here and here. And so that's a lot that we actually need to gather. Now, when you're using basting stitches together, you want to pull on the bobbin threads. Now, when I sewed this from the top down to the hem, so I know that my bobbin threads are on the right side of my fabric, and I'm just going to give them a gentle pull and not catch that stay stitching in there. So just make sure you pull your stay stitching thread out of the way. Grab your two bobbin threads, you can wrap them around your thumb, and then we're just going to start sliding our stitches along those bobbin threads until we get down here to this dot, the second one down at the bottom. So, okay, we're almost there. You want to keep your gathers as even as possible. This is something that just gets better with time. My grandma is awesome at gathering, and she can get them really, really even. I am not fabulous at it, but I can do a decent job. So don't be frustrated if your gathers don't look perfectly even. Just play around with it until you can get it right. And like I said, it'll improve with time and practice. So I'm going to go over to the other end, grab those bobbin threads. There we go. Okay, and I'm just going to pull them a little bit from this end to make sure that we get that part gathered down at that end. Okay, let's check this out and see how it looks with our two dots. I'm actually going to go and mark these a little bit darker with my pen so that I can see through them, see to the other side. And this is an erasable ink, heat erasable ink, so once I go and iron everything, these will disappear. Okay, so I have my two dots marked. We can see where our dots are on our front panel. And remember, we are lining up right sides, so we want to get these all lined up together. So you have your dot here, and there it is. So we've got these two matching up. I'm going to put a pin in here to just hold it in place. You want to make sure that your outside edges are also lined up. And now I'm going to go down here and do the exact same thing. Pull out those basting threads in case I need to adjust anything. Get my two dots lined up. There we go. Put in another pin. Now I'm going to check my gathers. Okay, so see, they're not quite lining up as much as we need them to. So I'm going to go back in here, grab these bobbin threads and adjust a little bit more get that edge all lined up. And so it's just kind of playing with it to get it to line up on this edge. And it does take some time. So be patient, you'll get the hang of it. And then once you get everything lined up, so that looks pretty good, you can move your gathers so they're a little bit more even. And if that pulls them out, like you can see it's too much down here, then you can just go back to your bobbin threads, pull a little bit more, hold on to them as you are moving your gathers. Now I gotta go back up to the top. So you can see what I'm doing. This is taking me a minute. It'll take you a minute. So just work it out. And then once you get everything lined up, this is what it's gonna look like. We're gonna go to the other side that I already did. It'll look like that. It'll be all lined up with that outside edge. And then you want to make sure that you match your shoulder seams. There is no mark at the center back seam, but we have some notches up here that we want to match. And then ease this in as best as you can. Remember, we're going to be basting, so we will have a little bit of adjusting we can do. And then we're going to line up this shoulder seam coming back around to the left front panel. And now we will head over to the sewing machine. Once you have your gathers pinned into place and you have your notches all matched and your shoulder seams matched, you may have had a hard time matching that top edge of the neck facing. So that's the part that goes around the back. Between the notches and the shoulder seams, it's a little bit full. And so if you look at the instructions, it says that you can clip that curve as needed. So that means that you can put in some extra little clips to make that little piece, the curved facing, bend, and then get everything matched up to the notches and the shoulder seams, and then have the edges all even without any bunching. Once you have all of your notches and circles and shoulder seams all matched up, the next step of pattern instruction number 13 is to baste. Now, first of all, we want to set our machine to a basting stitch, which is the longest stitch on the sewing machine. And then we want to get everything lined up. Now, we want to keep the gathers on the top of our stitch line. We do not want them getting pulled out as they go across the feed dog or moved from where we've pinned them. So put the flat, smooth side of your facing down, gathers up, and we are going to be basting. And it doesn't specifically say what our seam allowance should be. I'm gonna probably stitch this at 3/8. Just like I did my stay stitching. This is basting. We aren't going to go in and pull this out after the fact, so we just want to make sure that it's not going to show once we put in our permanent seam, which is the next step once we finish basting. So get everything lined up. Let's go in for a closer look. I am going to be basting at 3/8 of an inch. I just have my seam gauge lined up to kind of keep me on track. This is basting, so it does not have to be perfect, but we want to make sure that it's inside of that seam allowance. So just get your machine set and everything lined up and just start basting. Remove each pin as you come to it. Since we're basting, we're not going to need pins in the final stitching part of this. And just be careful as you are going over your basting or gathered stitches. As you're basting over your gathered stitches, you want to make sure you kind of keep them in place. I'm just going to put my finger here as these all go through and then take my time to just get that all done. So I'm going to pull out each pin as I get to it, but still hold my stitches in place with my finger, hold my gathers in place with my finger, and keep stitching and basting to get it all done. Okay, so we're almost through this part, and then we want to just keep basting around the rest of our shirt to hold this facing in place for our permanent stitch line. Once you get all your basting stitches in and you are comfortable with where your gathers are, it should be totally fine. There should be nothing wrong with it at this point. Make sure that you trim off any of those loose basting threads that you used for gathering. They may be all bunching up in here. We don't want to get those caught in our permanent stitch line because then we have to go pick them out. It just takes longer. So just trim up any loose threads that you have that are hanging out. And next we want to reset our machine to our usual stitch length. For me, that's 2.5. And I'm also going to move my magnetic seam gauge over to 5/8 of an inch, which is the standard width of a commercial seam. So we want to make sure that we are just going to be sewing this in a permanent stitch line at 5/8 of an inch. Let's go in for a closer look. I have my magnetic seam gauge all lined up at 5/8 of an inch, and I am starting right at this edge here. We are going to be folding this bottom edge of the facing back up and under, and then we'll be tacking it up here. So we want to make sure that we have a nice tight seam. So I'm just below this edge a little bit, and then I'm going to back stitch because we want to hold that in place. I'm just going to roll my needle down and then go forward a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch up to that edge and then go forward again. So we are just sewing at 5/8 of an inch. This is going to be pretty straightforward. Everything is where it needs to be because we've already basted it all in, and we are still sewing with our gathers to the top under our presser foot and not against the feed dog. So we have this smooth line against the feed dog. So just adjust your top and facings as needed. Make sure everything's lying flat under there. There it is. Okay, so it's all flat. We're just going to go back over those gathers and then repeat the entire process that we did with basting, but this time we are using a permanent stitch. And we're just coming back down to the other bottom edge, and we are going to repeat the process of back stitching at this bottom edge and then lift everything up, and you should have your permanent stitch line in there. Your basting stitches should be inside, and once we flip everything, you should not be able to see any stitches, which you cannot. And let's head over to the ironing board to give this a press and do some clipping. The last few steps of instruction number 13 are to trim your seams and then to press them towards the facing. So we're going to be pressing them towards the facing, but before we do that, we need to trim the seam allowance. And I am going to cut right next to that basting stitch line that I just sewed. I want to keep that basting in there just to kind of hold everything in place, and it's going to also help prevent this edge from raveling if that's a concern, but I just don't feel like cutting it super close because we do need something to press. So we need a little bit of an edge to be able to do that. And it's not super close, so just take your time. It's a little chunky through the gathers, but it's just going to be right along that basting line. I think that's a good amount to trim. Now next we are going to press the seam towards the facing. That is going to give us a nice crisp line on the other side. So get your iron set to a heat setting that is appropriate for your fabric. Mine is on cotton linen, and let's go in for a closer look. My seam allowance is trimmed right next to that basting stitch, so you can see that right there. And now we are going to press our seam allowance over towards the facing. So let me just get that lined up so you can see it a little bit better. And my iron is ready to go, so I'm just going to press with some steam to get that going in the right direction. And I'm just going to go down this edge for the entire garment and go all the way around. And then once I'm done, I'm going to flip it over and press again from the other side, and I'm going to just pull my facing so that I know I have a nice edge there and it's not like a weird ridge. So you do not have to do the second step if you do not want to. I just know from my personal experience that I don't like having this there, and the only way to get rid of it is to press from both sides. So you can kind of see that it's kind of a little bit of a roll there. We want to just pull that over and press. So now you know how to sew the band and attach it to the front of your shirt. Once you get that seam all pressed over towards the outside edge of the band, or facing as I sometimes happen to call it, you will be ready to proceed to the next step, which will be putting together the facing and then getting that attached to the shirt. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got a question or a comment, leave it below and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Until we meet again, happy sewing!